Hello cloud experts. Welcome to today's video. In this video, I'll be talking about AWS IAM core concepts that you should know to answer any IAM related interview questions or answer any AWS certification questions. If you just started with AWS and want to learn about IAM, or if you are an experienced AWS user but struggling with IAM fundamentals, then you are at the right place. In this video, I'll explain all the required IAM core concepts in easy and simplified way, and on the same time I am going to teach you some IAM core concepts that will help you to use IAM effectively in your day-to-day work. Before I start, I would like to request you, if you are new to our channel or haven't subscribed yet, then please subscribe to our channel and please click on the bell icon to get notification for any new topics. Now let's review the core concepts of AWS IAM. There are 5 main attributes that you should know, and I'll first go with the definitions. But don't worry, if you do not understand or if you are not clear about that, I have enough examples to clarify all your doubts. To start with user. Now an IAM user is an entity that you create in AWS. IAM user represent the person or an AWS service who uses that IAM user to interact with other AWS systems or services. Next, role. An IAM role is again an IAM identity that you create in your account and that has specific permission. It is like an IAM user, but instead of being uniquely associated with one person, a role is intended to assumable by anyone who needs it. I know you may be little confused about the user and role, but don't worry. In next slide, I have enough example to clarify that doubt. Moving forward, group. An IAM group is a collection of IAM users. Then policy. A policy again is an IAM object that normally you create with JSON format, and when we associate that IAM policy with any identity or any resources, that defines the permission of the users or the role. And last but not least, resources. Resources are all the AWS services that entities like IAM users, groups or roles they access, and policy helps them to define who has access versus who is not allowed to access that resource. Now let's see an example and clarify all those 5 tuples or main attributes of IAM. Let's assume Eliza is someone like us, an user. And what she wants to do here, she wants to create an S3 bucket. Now S3 bucket is an AWS service and Eliza, an user, she is trying to create. Now how Eliza can create that S3 bucket? Option 1, she can log into AWS Management Console, and from AWS Management Console, she can create that bucket. Option 2, she can access AWS CLI, it's a command line interface, and using AWS CLI, she can create that bucket. Or she can use AWS SDK for Python, Java, Rust, Ruby, whatever the language she want, and she can create that bucket. Now we saw these are the 3 options. There is another one option like Eliza is using some other AWS services and that service required to create an object. For our example, let's assume Eliza is using AWS Glue. It's an ETL service, and that ETL service to work properly, that ETL service require an S3 bucket. That is why indirectly Eliza is trying to create an S3 bucket from AWS Glue. Now what are the options to access this methods. If she wants to access AWS Management Console, then she needs login credential like user ID and password. But if she wants to use AWS SDK, then she required access key and secret access key. Now, when someone or you will create an user in IAM, there are options. You can create that access key and secret access key. It will give you an option to create programmatic access or not. If you select programmatic access, then you can create access key and secret access key. Similarly, to access AWS CLI, again you need access key and secret access keys. Now to this example, let's add little bit more complexity. Now let's say Sara and Radha, they are also from the same group and works closely with Eliza. So all these three associates, they are working together for the same purpose, maybe on the same projects. Now in our example, Eliza, Sara, Radha, they are the users or they are the individuals who wants to access AWS and AWS services. S3 is our resource that the user is trying to access. Since Eliza, Sara, Radha all are working for the same purpose, they are a group. And this is how group works in IAM also. It's a container for users. Now what you can do, you can individually give permission to Eliza, Sara, Radha, or maybe you can give permission to that entire group and you can add users and remove users. So it will reduce your burden and make your life easy or reduce the maintenance activity. Now, since we understand the users and the resources, let's try to understand the policy and the role little bit better. We saw in the developer group, there are three associates, Radha, Sara and Eliza. Now let's assume Eliza is team lead and there is a requirement that only team lead can create or delete an S3 bucket. Whereas developers, they should not have access to create or delete an S3 bucket. Only they can create or delete objects. Or else if everyone will have access to create and delete buckets, it may create catastrophe. That is why every IT project will have that kind of segregation of role. Now let's assume as part of daily work, Eliza resigned that position and in place John joined. Now John is again team lead. What we saw that only team lead will have access. Now the option is either I can give individual access to Eliza. When she will leave the team, I have to remove that access. When the replacement will come, again I have to give the similar access to the replaced person or John in our case, which is an overhead. Now to resolve that problem, what we can do, because who will have access to create an bucket? That particular role. It could be John today, yesterday it was Eliza, tomorrow it could be Sarah. It does not matter who is the user. What it matters, who is performing that role or taking that position. Exactly the same concept replicate in IAM. Role means it's not the individual entity or an user, but it is the responsibility that one user can take, and the role will help that user who is assuming that role to create or to delete or to perform the proper operation. Since we understood that role concept little better, now let's try to understand what is the policy. Here I have a small policy snippet. We'll first try to understand all different components of a policy. Then we'll explain what a policy all about. This is a very simple S3 policy. To start with, the statement block, this is the main block of a policy. Inside that, it has a seed, that means the statement ID. You can provide any value you want. The policy, as I mentioned, it either allow or deny an user's permission to a particular resource. Now, whatever you are going to add in the seed, it does not affect the action. Coming back to the next block, action. This is very important and it is mandatory, where you are going to list down all the actions like create bucket, delete bucket for a case of S3, where you are going to list all those privileges or permission that one user or role should have. Next component, effect. It can have either allow or deny. Allow means you are allowing that user or role to perform certain activities, what is listed in the action. If you deny, you are specifically saying that I don't want to allow that role or the user to perform those specified tasks. Next, resource. Resource means on what AWS object the permission is going to apply. For our case, it is an S3 bucket. And then the principal who is actually going to have that privilege. You can specify an IAM user or an IAM role. I believe it's clear all the different components of a policy and what it does. Now, as I told previously, the main purpose of a policy you can attach with one user or you can attach with one resource. And with that, you can define what level of permission the user should have or what level of permission you want to deny from that user. Now let's try to dive deep into the IAM policy and try to understand two very important concepts, implicit deny versus explicit deny. This is the previous policy example where we have action and we are specifying that create bucket and delete bucket, these two actions we are allowing to the role team lead. Now, as I mentioned in the previous example, there are two roles, one team lead and one developer. In this policy, we are explicitly allowing team lead to create an S3 bucket and delete an S3 bucket. That is why this policy will give explicit allow for a team lead. And since we are not mentioning any policy for developer role, it will implicitly deny any privilege for developers. In IAM or in policies, if you do not explicitly mention any allow, by default it will deny, and this deny called implicit deny. That means we did not specify the deny, but on the same time we haven't explicitly specify allow. That is why it is denying. Please make sure or please remember, whenever you are creating a policy, if you will not explicitly allowing any permission, AWS will not allow that IAM principal or IAM user or IAM role to access that resource. Now let's try to understand the explicit deny. Compared to previous example, here again I have two tasks in the action, create bucket and delete bucket. However, on the effect statement, I have deny instead of allow. That means I am explicitly mentioning that create bucket and delete bucket is not allowed for developer. Compared to previous policy, I explicitly allowed team lead to create bucket, delete bucket. Here I am explicitly denying the developers to create bucket and delete bucket. That is why this policy explicitly deny any permission for developer because I am specifying that deny permission. Now let's dive deep little bit more into this explicit deny and implicit deny. Let's consider scenario 1. I have two policies where policy 1 or A1 is giving allow permission. That means I am explicitly allowing, and the condition is if request is not from Antarctica. If the request is coming from Antarctica on June 1, 2020, then as per policy A1, it is default deny. Going to policy B, the second policy, again effect is allow and condition if request comes in on June 1, 2020. In that case, policy B is explicitly allowing. Since there is no explicit deny, that is why the final result will be allow. In contrast, for scenario 2, let's say policy A2, the effect is deny. That means it is explicitly denying if the request is coming from Antarctica. On the same time, policy B is saying Effect is allow, and if the request comes in June 1, 2020, since there is an explicit deny, the final result will be denied. Now to summarize, if any one of your policy or policy segment, if there is an explicit deny will take precedence on implicit allow or explicit allow. Even if there is an explicit allow, explicit deny will take the precedence and the final result will be denied. I hope that clarifies the concept. Now next, IAM principle of least privileges. This is very important concept, and AWS always recommend to use principle of least privileges. But before even explaining that, let's try to understand what is principle of least privilege. Now based on AWS language or based on the security terminology, it refers to granting user the minimum permission necessary to perform their task. In our day-to-day life, sometimes we give excess permissions, but principle of least privilege is saying exactly opposite thing. Allow only the permission that is absolutely required to perform their task. Let's try to understand with some policy examples. For our scenario, let's say John is team lead and John should only have create and delete S3 bucket, and Sarah is our developer who should have only create object and delete object. Sarah should not have create bucket or delete bucket permission, and John should not have create object, delete object permission. Now this is the example of first policy. For developer like Sarah, what we are going to give, we are giving all those actions. Create access grant instance, create job, create access point. You can see there are all other permissions that we are allowing with the policy to a developer like Sarah, what's really not required. So obviously this is not principle of least privilege, and AWS does not recommend to give this kind of or create that kind of policies. Now let's see another one policy example. If you see in a policy where we have the star statement, that means we are allowing everything for the user, including create, delete, all the permissions. Now, in contrast to this, where you are specifying certain action like S3 create access grant versus S3 star. S3 star is very dangerous. That means you are giving permissions to perform all S3 related activity to the developer. Again, this is very widely open policy and it's a direct violation of principle of least privileges for our example. Then what should be the ideal policy we should create for a developer? Here is the example. In this policy, in action, we are allowing delete object and put object, not delete bucket and the create bucket. To whom? To the developer. Whatever the permission the developer absolutely required, create and delete object, we are allowing only that permission. We are not giving any additional permission to S3 bucket. Now again, we are not giving to all the buckets. We are only specifying the bucket where it is absolutely required. This is an example of principle of least privileges. To reiterate or to summarize, assign the permission what is absolutely required to that resource. Now you may give delete object and put object, but you are giving to all the S3 buckets. Then it's again forfeiting the purpose. So you have to understand, you should give the absolutely required action to the resources where it is required. Both the combination in a perfect way will create principle of least privileges. Next, we'll move to a very important concept, that is cross account access. Before I explain, let me give you an example where you really need that. Let's say you have a developer account where all the developers do their day-to-day work. They have their permissions in the developer AWS account. In your organization, you have a production account where you are hosting all the production workload. As part of the production workload, there is a S3 bucket which is hosting or which is used for some kind of production workload. Now Sarah, a developer, she needs access to that production bucket. How you are going to resolve that solution? If you know that answer, you can pause the video here. You can try to create that solution, or you can write down the solution in a piece of paper and then unpause the video and match with me if you want to. Now, if you are thinking that you will create another one user for Sarah in the production account, then no, you are wrong. Today you have two accounts, but in actual use cases you may have 1,000 accounts. You can create 1,000 users in different account. But let's say if Sarah is departing that team, you have to make sure you are removing Sarah's access from all other accounts. And this is a maintenance nightmare. That is why AWS comes with a better alternative called cross account access. Now let's try to understand how cross account access works and how Sarah can get access to production bucket without having a dedicated user to the production AWS account. First step to the process is creating an IAM role in the production account. You will get multiple questions from any AWS certification exam. Please make sure the IAM role should be in that account where the developer or the user is trying to get access. Step 1, we have to create an IAM role to access that production bucket. Now step 2, after creating that IAM role, I have to grant access to that particular role such that the role will be able to access object from that production bucket. Next, we have to allow Sarah's user ID to assume right access role. That is another one important point to remember. If Sarah does not have access to assume role, that role name, whatever the role name you are creating, Sarah will not be able to access production bucket. So this is the prerequisite. Once you have all these three steps covered, next part, Sarah will try to assume that right access role. If Sarah's user ID has that access, or if Sarah is allowed to assume that role, then the role will provide a temporary credential. Now with that temporary credential, Sarah will request access to the production bucket, and that temporary credential will allow Sarah to access the object or create the object or retrieve the object from the S3 bucket. Now this is the way you can allow or you can allocate users from a different account to another one account without even creating individual users. I hope all these concepts are clear now and you will be able to work IAM more confidently. This was all about today's episode. At the end, I would like to thank you for your valuable time. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel to get unique and exciting opportunities on a regular basis. If you like my effort, please like this video and share with your friends. And last but not least, please don't forget to drop your feedback as comment to this video. Happy learning, please stay safe and take care.